Hi folks, welcome to a little makeup online lecture for the content that we didn't cover at the end of week 6 on social impact assessment. So I've got a chance to talk a little bit about some of your questions around social impact assessment that you included in your first assessment task at the end there. I'll briefly touch on one of those questions in particular because I think it's a good way of understanding how social impact assessment is used in relation to environmental impact assessment before we really get into the more progressive potential of social impact assessment, because that is really where we're at in terms of contemporary thinking about SIA and what it might be used for. So I did touch on this briefly, but in terms of how social impact assessment is done with regards to EIA, I did mention that most legislative criteria, most assessment criteria that is used for environmental impact assessment has increasingly begun to include triggers for social, community, economic impacts as a way of reflecting this gradual but continual broadening out of what's required through environmental impact assessment, and this growing recognition that the social and ecological impacts and effects of development are interrelated. So it's difficult to tease out what is purely an isolated ecological impact from its social context. Those two things are inevitably intertwined in ways that we have increasingly begun to acknowledge, and that is being reflected in the way that criteria are framed. So if we look at the referral criteria for Victoria, which I did mention in our last lecture, here we go. So this is page 7 of that referral document, which outlines what the triggers are for EIA for Victoria that I've put up on Blackboard under the Assessment Task 2 tab. But if you look at some of the triggers, some of the referral criteria, we look down a little bit again, as we talked about, ecological dimensions often are the most prominent in these, but for these points that are around, sorry, I'll go back to the top, where you only need one potential effect to trigger the need for an EIA, we've got a point on the potential extensive or major effects on health, safety or well-being of a human community. And over here, in this list of a combination of potential environmental effects that might trigger the need for an EIA. Now, don't forget, this is only how Victoria does it. Not every jurisdiction is going to break this up into, one or two effects and how we determine an EIA. But we have a couple more. Points that relate to social and/or economic effects of development. Key one here: major effects on social or economic well-being due to direct or indirect displacement, the impacts on residences and community infrastructure, amenity, health again, which does echo the other point a little bit there, but I guess the key difference here is you've got these direct references to air, water, noise, or chemical pollution and hazards, and you've got the 2 points at the end on Indigenous or Aboriginal cultural heritage impacts. Now, there has been a bit of discussion about the fact that these points should probably be over in the single referral trigger list, but it's just a bit of an indication that I wanted to ground this discussion in is these are the types of points that I talked about in terms of social impacts and economic impacts that need to be reflected in the scope of an EIA. Now, that's not to say, as I said last week, that we have to call that a social impact assessment, but following along from the rise of environmental impact assessment as a procedural process, it's one thing to think about the need to assess environmental impacts, But EIA really is a standardized process for going through that assessment. It's laid out logically. There is a standard or a relatively standard way of thinking through how we do assessments. And that type of procedure, that I guess you could call framing the investigation of social impacts as a sort of a relatively standardized procedural approach to that investigation that has that benefit. Once you turn these types of investigations, whether it's you're investigating environmental or social impact, into a more standardized procedural approach, you then have the chance to compare and contrast those different investigations across projects. There are benefits to standardizing your investigation or your approach to assessment. And so, given that we're increasingly acknowledging the need to investigate social impacts, we have developed a procedure around investigation that we call social impact assessment. Now, really, it's very much echoing the same type of practices that you'll see. And for those who've looked at, and I would encourage you to do this more, to look at already written environmental effects statements or environmental impact statements in Victoria or elsewhere, you'll see that there seems to be a relatively standardized way of, how do we look at the types of impacts? What types of things do we include? And we call it social impact assessment. And it's a way of bundling together a bunch of different things. So we look at this, amenity, we look at noise, we look at effects on human health and well-being, we look at effects on infrastructure, community infrastructure, housing, residential impacts, those types of things. We bundle it together. So back to the slides for a second. So in essence, that has come to be, those criteria have come to be expressed as social impact assessment. So a very basic summary, and Frank Van Clay, this is the paper I was going to add to the readings, but it didn't actually get a chance to, unfortunately. But this is what am I trying to say? An open source publication. I've included the full reference there if you want to have a bit of a look at the principles for social impact assessment, which might be helpful for your assessment task too, then I would encourage you to do so. And that document is very easy to read and very well laid out. But generally speaking, what we see in social impact assessment and the instrumental ways in which it's conducted is that it's largely developer-led. Just like EIA, it's about what type of impacts might we be having and how do we manage them effectively in a way that meets whatever triggers are outlined in the policy that we're dealing with. But as I said, it's been EIA that came first, and social impact has come as a result of acknowledging this interconnectedness of the social and ecological. And so SIA is behind, and we don't see as well integrated processes in a number of places. So it's a couple of decades behind environmental impact assessment. But perhaps I think the most important thing to talk about with social impact assessment is how could we move beyond this instrumental approach? And something I just wanted to mention is that the rise of ideas like social and environmental justice as key platforms that need to be reflected in policy and practice is a real opportunity for social impact assessment. So rather than just assessing what the impacts of a single development might be, we might be able to use it more strategically. And as I have said previously, social impact assessment can be a way of trying to promote the employment benefits of a project. We can talk about the impacts of displacement of communities, but it can also be a chance for developers to talk up the economic benefits and potential of their project and how that relates to social benefits, mainly through employment. But there are a whole host of different other ways that social impact assessment could and has, in very patchy ways, been used more proactively. And it could be, and I think evidently it is about being more strategic in thinking through how we would do this. But I think that a really big potential might be to say, well, we've got this idea of a social license to operate. We talked about that earlier on, but it's often not necessarily embedded in anything in particular. What does a social license actually look like on paper or in practice? That's not necessarily a well developed, well conceptualized process. Maybe social impact assessment could be the basis for a social license to operate, or it might be the basis for a corporate social responsibility plan. We're making, as an organization, we're making these claims about our level of social responsibility, but if we actually embedded that in a social impact assessment of the communities that are directly and indirectly affected by our practices, maybe it would have a bit more credibility. Maybe people would take our claims a bit more seriously, and maybe as as the organisation itself and its employees, they might feel like they actually have a responsibility, a clear and tangible responsibility to uphold. Now, a couple of really interesting points that Frank Van Clay in particular has pointed out about, sort of pulling a bit like, you can think about strategic environmental assessment as an attempt to pull EIA out of this instrumental, developer-led, project-specific, narrowly defined process. You might not necessarily need to change the terminology of social impact assessment to achieve the same thing, but to pull it above that level, to give it some opportunity for wider application. It could be about drawing attention to issues of inequality in development proposals. It could be a way of saying, well, look, one thing about environmental impact assessment is that if we're not careful, we can think about environmental impacts in very narrowly defined scientific ways. And not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, but there are multiple ways of knowing and understanding environmental impact. And so, for example, social impact assessment could be used more progressively to understand Indigenous perspectives on the impacts of mine development. There's a big push in South Australia at the moment to identify sites for nuclear waste disposal, and the seeming, what appears to be a neglect of Indigenous perspectives on the location of sites and their appropriateness. Would those mistakes, would those blind spots be rectified somewhat if we thought about what constitutes knowledge and expertise in ways that were beyond just the scientific and the policy expertise and the institutional knowledge? And does it also open up a chance for a more democratic process of decision making? As we talked about earlier on, most of the public participation in EIA is about how do we tick the boxes for what's required through our legislation, or how do we help to frame our project in a way that people are less likely to object to. We don't do a lot of what could this project look like if we opened it up to the people who are affected in terms of design and implementation. Now, maybe that possibility is greater through social impact assessment. And so, it might not necessarily be of any value, but to think more about strategic social assessment, to think strategically and holistically, might be a way to advance social impact assessment. And I think perhaps a good example of this, and perhaps connecting back to a couple of the other questions that people had on their assessment tasks, what are the roles for those outside of government and for researchers and for the community in general in trying to participate in, promote, understand, even to commission social impact assessments? A big push for green cities, making our cities greener for health benefits, for heat island effect, for all sorts of different things, and all very valid and very important. But growing recognition that also creating more green areas in cities tends to drive out those in lower socioeconomic groups, and it can have a big impact on those who are vulnerable. So, how do we think about creating designing, implementing greener cities might be something that we get a better handle on through some type of social impact assessment. So if we were to think about a green cities plan as something that had a social impact assessment embedded within it, that might be a really important, helpful, very democratic way of going about this type of thing, and it might actually enable us to say, as has been in the case in the past, that look, we need to combine the greening of cities with housing policy. We need to have rent-controlled apartments. We need to have government-owned public housing to keep rents down in certain areas that mean that people aren't driven out by a rise in property prices, for example. A whole range of different things can emerge from these types of processes. But that's a very brief, well, not so brief, concise, I would say. Still detailed discussion of social impact assessment, probably more detailed than we would have managed in the lecture itself. If you have any questions about social impact assessment, do let me know. But the best way to get a handle on it, of its current application, would be to look at some of those EESs, particularly on the Victorian government referral site, the one I linked to under Assessment Task 2, get a feel for how social impact assessment is done, how it's framed, how it connects with EIA. And that'll be helpful for understanding how you might, in your assessment task, think about, if you are proposing that an EIA is needed for your project, what type of aspects, what type of elements would be included in the scope of that EIA to do with social impact assessment? Are there amenity issues? Are there displacement issues in terms of having to move people, resite towns, villages, etc.? Those types of things. How are you going to frame those? What needs to be looked at and explored? And that could be a very helpful process for understanding how you might go about that. Just another small point, and I will post a little thing about this. I had to take a little bit of time off this week, which meant I haven't been able to get to your assessment task 1 in terms of finishing them all off just yet. So they were due to be released back to you this Friday. I'm going to move that back a week, so my apologies for that. You won't get your first assessment task back as I'd hoped this Friday. It will be delayed a little bit until next Friday, so apologies for that in advance. I will also do a online chat next Thursday primarily for our online students to discuss any questions about assessment task 2. I will open that up to everyone though, of course, so I'll post more details, but if you want to be involved in the Google Hangout chat, if you have specific questions about assessment task 2 that you would like to ask, that will happen next Thursday at 5:30, probably 5:30 p.m. till about 7 or so, and you can drop in at any time and ask your question. So we'll post some more details about that in the coming days. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next Wednesday night. Thanks, guys.